Truly my pleasure to welcome Dan Kurtzer to campus. Dan will be speaking today, as you know, on the topic of Israel, Palestine, and the old new Middle East. Let me just briefly introduce Dan. He currently serves as the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. That's coming on top of a 29-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service. Ambassador Kurtzer, I should say, served as the U.S. ambassador to Israel and also as the United States ambassador to Egypt. He was also a speechwriter and member of Secretary of State George Shultz's policy planning staff and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs and as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research in the State Department. Professor Kurtzer was a member of the Middle East Peace Team for Secretary of State James Baker and Secretary of State Warren Christopher. He played an instrumental role in formulating and executing American policy, in particular helping to bring about the Madrid Peace Conference. Following that breakthrough, Professor Kurtzer was named as the coordinator of the multilateral peace talks, served as the U.S. representative to the bilateral talks between Israel and the Palestinians and between Israel and Syria, and chaired the U.S. delegation to the multilateral refugee negotiations. Professor Kurtzer has authored many books, including as co-author Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, American Leadership in the Middle East, also as co-author of The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, 1989 to 2011, and also as the editor of Pathways to Peace, America in the Arab-Israeli Conflict. After retiring from the State Department, Professor Kurtzer served as a member of Secretary of State John Kerry's Foreign Affairs Policy Board and also as an advisor to the bipartisan Iraq Study Group. I should also note that in 2007, Professor Kurtzer was named the first commissioner of the Professional Israel Baseball League. That's quite an accomplishment. Ambassador Kurtzer received his PhD in political science from Columbia University and, again, practices that as a professor at Princeton. With that, Dan, welcome. Let me turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. I want to thank Professor Steinfeld and the Watson Institute for the invitation to come today. I also want to say a virtual hello to your president, Chris Paxson, who was my dean at Princeton, and you are very lucky. We're unlucky that she's here, and you are lucky that she's here. So I hope that message gets to her. Your laughter about my service as a baseball commissioner reminds me that when I was named the commissioner of baseball, my 3 grown sons said to me it was about time I did something worthwhile with my life. So. When I retired from the Foreign Service in 2005 and went to Princeton, I was asked in the first semester I was there to reflect on the state of the Middle East. It's an appropriate phrase today with the State of the Union coming tonight. And the question was, what could I say generally about the condition of particularly Arab states in the Middle East, having spent virtually all of my academic professional life thinking about and working in and on the region. But I approached that question with a great deal of hesitation because, as some of you know, there's been a long debate, particularly among academics, about whether Westerners should have anything to say about the Middle East, since, according to one side of that debate, Westerners have caused many of the Middle Eastern problems through imperialism and penetration. The other side of that debate, of course, was that the Middle East is so messed up that the Westerners couldn't have done anything worse to make it worse. But I approached this question with some hesitation until I realized that just a couple of years earlier, in 2002, the United Nations Development Program had asked a large number of Arab intellectuals and public policy personalities to look in the mirror and to analyze themselves, to analyze their own societies, rather than have the analysis come from the outside. And the UNDP said to these professionals and policy people that the UNDP would then try to focus its programs to ameliorate the problems that these folks had found. And in fact, in 2002, UNDP published the first of what became several Arab Human Development Reports, in which Arabs took a look at themselves and their societies and said, we've identified a number of what they called deficits. The first deficit that they identified was a deficit of freedom, both political and economic freedom. They said that if Arab societies want to advance and make progress both economically and politically, the governments have to provide more space for people to be free and to act freely both in economic and political terms. The second deficit that was identified was a deficit of knowledge. Now, what the Arab intellectuals said was that the Middle Eastern people are as smart as anybody else, but what's wrong is their educational system. There are too few schools. Much of the education is based on rote memorization rather than challenging people to think. And the system needed to be basically thrown out and started over again. And the third deficit, which was extraordinarily interesting, coming more than 20 years ago, was the deficit of women's empowerment. And this group said, if you want 100% of the society to advance, you need 100% of the people having the capability of promoting whatever it is, whether it's economic progress or social progress, cultural progress. And most Arab societies have denied women equal access to jobs, education, and so forth. And so when I approached the subject in 2006 at Princeton, and since then, I've used the UNDP study to think about what I call the old new Middle East. And the reason I call it the old new Middle East is that if you look at the subsequent Arab Human Development Reports, very little has changed. Not nothing. For example, in Saudi Arabia, we know that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has articulated a plan called Saudi Arabia 2030, and he has promoted some degree of liberalization of some aspects of society. Women can now drive. They don't have to be escorted all over the place with a male in company. They can attend cultural and sporting events. But it's still a long way to go, and Saudi Arabia, in a sense, is still bucking the tide because there's a large, as we know, a large religious establishment, the Wahhabi religious establishment, which so far has been relatively quiet in the face of these changes, but everyone's holding their breath about whether or not this will, in fact, take hold and move forward. But what this UNDP report really indicated was the degree to which the Middle East is fraught with problems. It's an authoritarian wonderland. You either have republics that are authoritarian, or you have republics that are praetorian. In other words, the military stands behind a leader, usually who had come from the military, or you have monarchies. You don't have a lot of democratic choices. Lebanon used to be a shining light. It's now a failed state. Tunisia, after the Arab Spring, for a couple of years was making progress. It still has not collapsed, but it is not fully on the road to what we would call democracy. And you look elsewhere, and there really isn't much to look at. The region is defined by weak leaders. We used to look at the Middle East through the prism of what happened in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. Those were the three pillars of kind of Middle Eastern influence. And it's no more. Right now, the pillars of influence are essentially states on the periphery. Israel, Iran, and Turkey count much more for what happens in that region than Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. And not only that, but as state structures have weakened, they've been replaced. They've been replaced by non-state actors. Consider the following. Since 1973, the war involving Israel, Egypt, and Syria, there has not been another interstate war in the Middle East involving Israel. Every war that Israel has engaged in since 1973 has been a war with a non-state actor. The PLO a couple of times, Hezbollah a couple of times in Lebanon, and now Hamas, which we'll get to in a moment. In other words, the states are no longer even critical players in what used to be defined as the defining issue of Middle Eastern politics, which was the Arab-Israeli conflict and problem. The breakdown of borders, which characterizes much of the Middle East. You remember when ISIS or Daesh emerged a few years ago, it emerged in an area between Syria and Iraq that was considered to be ungoverned and maybe ungovernable space. But those spaces exist elsewhere, in the Sahel, just south of the Arab rim on the northern part of Africa. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda 2.0, ISIS 2.0 continue to exist. And they're finding their ability to exist in these ungoverned spaces because the states surrounding those spaces are not strong enough to guard their borders, let alone to extend that influence into neighboring areas. Weakness of civil society. In Egypt, for example, where my wife and I served for a total of about 7.5 years. I was there early in my career as a political officer before going back later in my career as ambassador. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of NGOs, non-governmental organizations operating in civil society. But almost all of them are essentially government NGOs. In other words, the Egyptian government, for a variety of reasons, finds it useful to operate some of its activities through these civil society organizations. So they're not really civil society, where if you just think about our own experience here or in Europe or in other countries, where civil society sometimes acts as a bit of a check or certainly an additive element in what happens within the society. And the economies are largely still rentier. They're still not producing much of value for the rest of the world other than what they can pump out of the ground, oil and gas, or out of the sea. Very little value added, and remarkably very little intra-regional trade. A few years ago, I haven't updated the number, but I don't think it's changed much. A few years ago, it was determined that only 7% of trade in the Middle East was inside the region. Now, I'm not a business person, but if I'm going to do trade, I want to do it with my neighbors. The volume of trade in what's now called the MCA, used to be the NAFTA between United States, Canada, and Mexico, is enormous. And the reason is because we're right next door to each other. And it's fast and it's cheaper transportation and all kinds of reasons why you want to trade with your neighbors. Well, in the Middle East, it's more trading is out like spokes of a wheel, either to Asia or to Africa or to Europe. So it's a region with significant challenges and problems, and it remains very much stuck in some of these issues. Perhaps the most significant of which is the segue to the topic that I really want to talk about, is the problem of endemic conflicts in that region, which seem impervious to resolution. Now, we're going to talk a lot this evening about Israel-Palestine, Israel-Hamas, but let's put it into perspective. It is one of the least significant conflicts in the Middle East. When you judge a conflict by the degree of fatalities and injury to population, think about Syria. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, by the Syrian regime, millions displaced from their home or refugees in Europe and elsewhere. Think about Yemen, civil war, tens of thousands of people killed, and then a war with Saudi Arabia, additional tens of thousands of people killed. Back in the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq war had nothing to do with Israel or Palestine. Think about Libya. Think about Algeria just a couple of decades ago. The persistent conflict in the Western Sahara between Morocco and the Polisario. Not that many fatalities, but a boiling conflict that has not been resolved. So I only say this not to diminish the importance of what's happening in Gaza or Israel-Palestine, but for us to think about the fact that this is a region that seems to produce protracted conflicts. And Israel-Palestine is certainly one of those, and we're going to talk about why and how it became so. But it's also a reason to put it into a perspective that should motivate us to be as concerned about other conflicts as many of us are about this particular conflict. Several years ago, I asked my graduate students at Princeton to do a deep study of whether or not the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli conflict was resolvable. And this question of whether a two-state solution can emerge ever, or is there an alternative, was the motivating factor for the question. And the students said to me the first day, they said, we assume you want us to prove that only a two-state solution can work, but we're going to disprove that. We're going to prove that there are alternatives. I said, that's great. And 12 weeks later, they came back and said, the only one that really can work is a two-state solution. Not that it's easy to accomplish, and it may be a long way off until we can get to it, but they went down a list of 8 or 9 alternatives: 1 state, 3 states, federation, confederation, long-term autonomy, and so forth. And for one reason or another, either Israelis couldn't accept it in their estimate, Palestinians couldn't accept it in their estimate, or both couldn't accept it. And you ended up with the idea of partition, which has been around since the 1930s, during the period of the British Mandate, when the British finally gave up on what they hoped would have been a one state in which the Zionist community and the Palestinian Arab community could live together. They threw up their hands and said, partition. We have to separate this into 2 entities. And that has become the watchword ever since. 1937, 1947, when the United Nations General Assembly formally voted for partition. And then this idea of a 2-state solution, which is effectively partition. Jews, Israelis will be in one state. Palestinians will be in another state. We hope, in the context of a 2-state solution, that they'll figure out how to live with each other, but it'll be by choice. In other words, the 2 sovereign states will then make a decision on how to interact, rather than have one dominate the other, which has been the case for Palestinians ever since 1949. Between 1949 and 1967, Egypt maintained a military administration over Gaza. Between 1949 and 1967, Jordan annexed the West Bank. And since 1967, Israel has maintained occupation of both the West Bank and Gaza, even though in 2005, during the time I served as ambassador in Israel, Israel formally, quote-unquote, disengaged from Gaza, but in fact, according to international law, has maintained an occupation. They're still an occupying authority, even though they are no longer present in Gaza. So the students looked at the 3 critical issues that the peace process, as we have come to call it, focused on over the years. One, of course, was territory. Who gets what? Now, back in the days when the Britain and then the United Nations were thinking about partition, the numbers were relatively even. The Peel partition plan in 1937 assigned a majority of the land to Palestinians and a minority or smaller part of the land to the Zionist movement. United Nations kind of flipped that, but it was close, 65 or 60 to 40, something like that. But as a result of the war in 1967, or I'm sorry, as a result of the war in 1947-49, Israel ended up in control of 78% of the land. Palestine, land of Israel, however you call it. And so since 1967, the peace process has been based on the question of whether or not you will have two states, one comprising 78% of the territory, the state of Israel, and one comprising 22% of the territory. The problem with that is my graduate students and most analysts of this conflict understand is that that's a solution to the 1967 problem. In other words, if this problem is to be resolved as a result or in contrast to occupation, then you take the situation in 1967 and you revert to it. Israel controls 78%, you push them back to 78%, Palestine then becomes the other 22%, and they live happily ever after. But what if Palestinians are not happy with 22%? And they want to go back to 1948 and say, no, it's a do-over. We want the ability to argue for a larger share of the land. And so you have a territorial conundrum. Do you focus on 48 or 49? Do you focus on 67? And what makes it interesting, I'm sure you all have heard, maybe here on campus, but certainly around, you have people now shouting in the streets, largely pro-Palestinian, I don't want to say pro-Hamas, but certainly pro-Palestinian, the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free." Their argument is 1948, essentially. Israel should not be there. Palestine should control all of the territory. What you do with the Jews of Israel is a different story. But that's the argument that some people infer from the river to the sea. But you also hear it on the other side, when, especially now that you have a government in Israel is comprised of extremists on the right, they don't want a Palestinian state at all, not even in 22% of the land, and they want to control all of the land from the river to the sea. In fact, that phrase was used by a member of Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet, not exactly in those words, but basically said, we're going to control all the land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. So both sides now are focused, number one, on territory. The students and the sides are also focused on the question of refugees. Back in the 1947-49 period, as we know, about 756,000 Palestinians were uprooted one way or another from their homes. Major debate among the political leaders and a major debate among academics. Were they pushed out by Israeli forces? Were they asked to leave by Arab leaders who wanted to clear the battlefield? Did many of them leave simply because refugees leave during periods of war? We know that. People are scared. They don't want to be around when the fighting is taking place outside their door. Whatever that's a whole different debate which we can talk about, but 756,000 people left, and the United Nations, in its wisdom, created a special agency to handle those people, called the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, what we now know of as UNRWA. You've seen it in the news. UNRWA is one of the longest existing UN agencies in their system. In fact, it was created about 2 years before the larger agency, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which handles all of the refugees in the world. So Palestinians have their own agency, and then everybody else has UNHCR. Okay? The problem then is, do you only focus on the 756,000, not all of whom are still with us, or do you accept UNRWA's calculation that children, grandchildren, and now even great-grandchildren of those refugees should be counted among the rolls of refugees? which puts you probably about 4 to 5 million. And if many of the refugees insist upon a narrow definition of a United Nations General Assembly resolution, 194, that said that refugees should have the right to return to their homes in Palestine if they're prepared to live in peace. If you hold that definition, which the United States, Israel, and much of Europe do not, but if you hold that definition, Israel would be inundated by 4 or 5 million Palestinians, many of whom would want to come, quote unquote, home to where they or their ancestors left. So refugees is not simply a numbers question. The question is, what happens to them? Now, the UN resolution also offered alternatives. Resettlement in place, financial assistance to pay people for their the misery and what they went through. How many people might accept that as opposed to wanting to go back to where they were? Third issue, obviously, is Jerusalem, which many people call the epicenter of the conflict itself. And Jerusalem is problematic not only as an Israeli-Palestinian issue, but there are at least 3 other stakeholders. There's Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Because you have the 2 political entities that have been talking about Jerusalem in the negotiations, Israel and the Palestinians, but you also have among the holiest places of these 3 religions in this 1 square mile old city of Jerusalem. You have the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the 3rd holiest mosque in Islam. You have the Via Dolorosa, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, holy to Christianity. And you have the Western or Wailing Wall, which is the outer wall of what had been the place where Jewish temples of old were located. And so you have in this very small locale an incredible religious dilemma. How do you deal with this? Can you split the old city in some way that everybody gets a share of what they want? Do you extract the old city from the conflict, as a group of Canadians did some years ago? I worked with them on a project called the Jerusalem Old City Initiative. If anybody's interested, you can Google it. We wrote a lot of stuff on how to govern the old city separate from Israel and a Palestinian state. The object being, let's agree on everything else besides Jerusalem, and then let's ask the 2 sides to forego the extension of sovereignty in the old city and figure out how it gets governed without being a sovereign part of one or the other state. It's a very clever, creative, I shouldn't say that because I participated in the project, but it was the Canadians who ran it, so I'll give them the credit. And in fact, in 2008, 7 and 8, when Prime Minister Ehud Olmert was negotiating with President Mahmoud Abbas, he took many of these ideas and brought them into negotiation. He was ready in that negotiation to not extend sovereignty in the old city if the Palestinians agreed not to extend sovereignty as well. He had some modifications of the ideas that the Canadians came up with, but the point was that Jerusalem is in itself, if you solve everything else in the conflict, you're still stuck with this epicenter, as I call it, of religious dispute among the parties. Now, if we look to the backdrop to what we're facing today, the war in Gaza, the horrific massacre that took place on October 7th, and the horrific bombing and killing of civilians in Gaza since October 7th. If we look to the backdrop, the Middle East in some ways found itself caught between high-speed traffic going in 2 different directions. Because at almost the same time as Arab states were starting to come to grips with the quote-unquote reality of Israel and the need to make peace with Israel, talking about the 1970s, the emergence of a peace leader in Egypt, Anwar Sadat, he largely wanted to make peace with the United States, but knew that the door to open that peace with the United States ran through a peace treaty with Israel. At the same time that was starting to change, Islamism was growing. Literally the same time. Think about it. Iranian Revolution, 1979. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan later that year, and the rise of the Mujahideen. The Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and the rise of Hezbollah, a militant Shia Islamic movement. And then the first intifada in Palestine in late 1987 and the rise of Hamas. So you had these two processes moving at high speed in opposite directions. Because what's happening? Saddam makes peace with Israel. Egypt makes peace with Israel. Gets ostracized in the Arab world for a number of years. But the Arab world starts to change. And by 1988, the same time that Hamas is emerging, the PLO is taking a decision to accept a two-state solution. It's extraordinary. The ironies of this period are quite amazing. Not only those related to Israel-Palestine. Who supported the Mujahideen against the Soviets? We did. We provided the Mujahideen with arms and advice on how to defeat the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And what became of the Mujahideen? They became Al-Qaeda. We nurtured the group that was ultimately to attack us. Who supported the Islamists in Gaza who became Hamas? Israel. I can tell you from firsthand experience, I was stationed in Israel as a political officer in 1982 to 86, and I traveled to Gaza every week for 4 years. It was a time when you could take a self-drive, you drove down, you parked your car, and you had lunch on the beach, you met with people, and you sent a report to Washington. This is what's happening in Gaza. It didn't take long for me to go into the military government in Israel and say, why are you supporting the Islamists over the nationalists? Because the money was coming in from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, and they were building mosques like crazy in Gaza, and they were building what became the Islamic University in Gaza, and the nationalists were on the run. And the Israelis in the early 1980s finally admitted, we like the Islamists better because they just want to be religious. They want to pray. The nationalists want a state. They want our territory, the territory that we claim. So it was Israel back in the 1980s that helped support, I don't want to say they created, but they helped support the group that became Hamas. And we're going to talk in a minute how that repeats itself in the period before the October 7th massacre. Irony. 1988, I mentioned the PLO comes out in support of a two-state solution through a decision by its highest governing body, the Palestine National Council. 1988, the same year, Hamas comes into being and establishes a charter that calls for the destruction of the state of Israel and the killing of all the Jews. Now, they changed that latter part later on, but they haven't changed the idea that the destruction of the state of Israel is part and parcel of what they believe in. Same thing happens on the other side. As Israel starts to take decisions in the late 1980s and then at the Madrid Conference and the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s, an extremist group is emerging within Israel that is fighting like hell to prevent a peace process from happening. An American immigrant to Israel, Baruch Goldstein, killed 29 people in a mosque, I think it was 29, in Hebron. A militant settler, religious settler in Israel, assassinated the prime minister. Settlers kept building settlements, which was taking up the land, that 22% even, was taking up the land that should have been designated for a Palestinian state. So you have, as I say, this highway with two fast lanes. Israeli and Palestinian willingness to make peace is going pretty fast in one direction, and the other direction are the spoilers and the opponents of peace. The question then is, why are we where we are today? Because if in fact this is a multi-directional possibility, well, the peace process might have succeeded in place of the success of the militants on both sides. And yet, peace process has not succeeded, and many have even called into question whether or not there can be a peace process. Right now, attitudes in both Israel and Palestine have hardened to a point where you mention a two-state solution and you get run out of the room. Support for Hamas, at least in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, even among those who don't agree that they should have conducted a massacre, but support for Hamas as a resistance group is at an all-time high, particularly in the West Bank, which is not suffering the devastation that Gaza is suffering. So where are we headed, and how do we get here? I think it's important to digress for one moment and talk about why October 7th happened. Because you have this strong state called Israel, with one of the strongest armies in the world, an economy which is larger than almost all European economies. Not quite at the top, but certainly in the top third of European economies. A high-tech economy, which is growing by leaps and bounds every day. What do they call it? Startup nation. And yet, there was this amazing systemic failure on October 7th. Let me just point out three things, because they're going to come back now in the analysis of what do we do as a result of the war. First of all, there was a decision, an affirmative decision, by the Prime Minister of Israel for over 10 years to favor Hamas over the PLO. Harkens back to the 1980s. Netanyahu, there's quotes attributed to him that it's better to deal with Hamas and to work out what they call a hudna, a short-term ceasefire of sorts, than it is to deal with the PLO, which wants Israel to withdraw from the territories that it occupied. Members of Netanyahu's government said the same thing. Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, one of the most radical ministers in the Israeli government, about a year or so ago, was quoted as saying, and I think I have the quote right, Hamas is an asset, the PLO is a liability. It's extraordinary. It was extraordinary when he said it before October 7th. It's even more extraordinary to hear it, that someone could have thought that Hamas was a better asset for Israeli national security interests than the PLO. Not only did they support Hamas, but as you know, Netanyahu allowed millions and millions of dollars, cash money as they say, to enter Gaza through Ben Gurion Airport for Hamas. Part of the problem, number one. Part of the problem, number two. For those of you who've studied the 1973 war involving Israel, Egypt, and Syria, one of the most interesting aspects is why the Israelis were surprised on Yom Kippur, on that day in October when the Egyptian and Syrian armed forces attacked. And what we've learned, and it's been confirmed in a variety of ways, is that the intelligence community in Israel, and they have a very good intelligence community, became attached to what they called a concept. And the concept said, it is far more important to look at the intentions of our enemies than their capabilities. We want to keep track of their capabilities so we know what they have. But at the end of the day, if we assess that they don't intend to fight us, we can stand down. And that's what happened before October 1973. The Egyptian military, which certainly had capabilities, started practicing crossing the Suez Canal. And the Israelis watched this. The Israelis had an unbelievable human asset, as they call it, a spy. You know, the first president, or actually the second, but technically the second president of Egypt after the 52 revolution, a gentleman named Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was president until 1970, very militant. His son-in-law was a spy for Israel before the 1973 war. He wanted money, and he spied, and he got money. And he told the Israelis a couple of days before the war that there was going to be a war. So they saw what the Egyptians were doing. They saw the capabilities. 4 or 5 times in 1973, before the actual crossing of the canal, Egypt had mobilized its forces as though it was prepared to cross the canal. Israelis, the first time that happened, mobilized their forces, and then nothing happened. And the second time the Egyptians mobilized, the Israelis kind of watched it, and the third and fourth time they paid no attention. Deception, strategic deception. And what happens in 2023, before October 7th? We now know that the Israeli intelligence community had an extremely strong, good, accurate window into exactly what Hamas was planning. They, about a year before October 7th, Israel obtained, through its intelligence capabilities, obtained a PowerPoint deck, slides, that showed exactly what Hamas was planning to do. The Israeli Signals Intelligence Unit, it's called 8200, was watching every day and listening every day to the preparations for what became October 7th. And they didn't have to search hard, because we know, we've seen it on CNN, Hamas built a mock Israeli military base to specification right up along the border between Gaza and Israel. And Hamas militants were invading that mock-up base all the time, practicing. We also know that the young women of 8200, and I specifically mention young women because that unit is largely staffed by women who the Israelis have determined are much better at following details than us men. In other words, if you're looking at the same screen every day, you have to be attuned to details to see something out of place today that was not there last Tuesday. Okay? These women were reporting up the chain that Hamas is preparing something big. And we have read in the Israeli press that the senior officers in Israel said to some of the women, if you keep bothering us, we're going to court-martial you. In other words, they stifled the reports. An intelligence failure akin to 1973 and in some ways much worse. And there was a military operational failure. There's a whole Gaza brigade that's supposed to protect the communities around the Gaza Strip from terrorism and other possibilities. At least half of that brigade was shipped off to the West Bank before October 7th to protect settlers. And because the attack took place on a Jewish religious holiday, Israel, according to its custom, sent many of the soldiers home to be with their families. And so there were probably fewer than 100 Israeli soldiers on that line, also akin to 1973 and what was then called the Bar-Lev line. Not only that, each of the communities has a kind of civil guard. In other words, the tripwire. Something happens, they get mobilized, they call back to Tel Aviv or to the closest base, and they serve as a first line of defense. The army had taken some of the weapons away from the civil guard because the West Bank needed them. So you put all of these together, and it is the perfect storm of failure, systemic failure. It also explains, in some ways, the anger, the thirst for revenge, and the scope of Israel's response. When I say it explains it, I'm not saying it justifies it. But in a situation where all of the assets of your society have essentially collapsed at the same time, and they were designed to protect the people of Israel. And the result is, 1,200 plus people killed in torturous, barbaric ways. Just today, I think it was, maybe yesterday, the UN finally conceded that there was horrendous violence against women, sexual violence against women, rapes and gang rapes and everything. So 1,200 people are killed in a horrible way. More than 200 are taken hostage, and we're not talking about 200 soldiers. We're talking about maybe 25 or 30 soldiers, and the rest civilians, including, I particularly care about older people these days, when I look in the mirror, including elderly, women, children, babies, and 130 of them are still being held hostage. So that systemic failure helps us understand the anger, anxiety in Israel. A friend of mine, about a week ago, said to me, Israel's not even in PTSD yet. It's still in trauma. But you now have a mirror imaging, because for the last 150 days, I think it's now 151, Israel has bombed and invaded Gaza and killed upwards of 30,000 people. We don't know how many of those 30,000 are the soldiers of Hamas. Israel's estimates run from 10 to 12,000. Let's take the high end. 12,000 are the militants, some of whom invaded Israel, and they're part of the war. That leaves 18,000 civilians. And you see it every night on the news, the destruction of the homes and the infrastructure in Gaza. So you now have 1.6 or 7 million people dislocated and uprooted in Gaza. And you have more than 200,000 people dislocated and uprooted in Israel because they have not yet been satisfied about security to rebuild the communities around Gaza. And they have withdrawn the population from the northern border because of concern about escalation from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which is still a possibility. So this war is far from over, and it is, I'm trying to find a better word, it is understandable how both sides are doing exactly what they're doing. It may not be acceptable, but it's understandable. And that makes this so challenging. So where does it leave us today? You have followed probably very closely the possibilities, the prospects of what could be a package deal, of a ceasefire, the release of some hostages in return for the release of some Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, a dramatic increase in humanitarian assistance going into Gaza. The question, though, is, let's take an optimistic, I don't know how to do this, but I'll try. Let's take an optimistic view. And in the next few days, our president has been optimistic that we'll have such a deal. In the next few days, we will see a maybe 6-week ceasefire, and we'll see what looks like a multi-stage process of trading hostages for prisoners. Some women come out first. The way the newspapers are reporting it, for the women, they get back, each one gets 3 Palestinian prisoners. So if there are 15 women, 45 Palestinian prisoners. And then you get some of the older people, and they get maybe 6 prisoners or 10 prisoners. The numbers go up until you get to Israelis of military age, and that's when your number goes very high. Let's take an optimistic view that that starts to happen, and that as a result of the ceasefire, the humanitarian assistance can go in a much more significant way. It doesn't resolve the question, however, of what we call the day after or the morning after. Because in 2014, there was a 57-day, I think, war between Israel and Hamas. And after that war, the international community, in its wisdom, came up with a rather interesting plan for the reconstruction and rehabilitation of Gaza. And the European Union and others put in a lot of money, and Gaza was rebuilt, and now it's all destroyed again. So, the day after, who's going to pay for the reconstruction and rehabilitation of Gaza? Who's going to maintain law and order in the immediate aftermath? Who's going to maintain security? Will Israel insist upon remaining in Gaza, as it has talked about, or creating security zones that divide the population? Which, if you recall, in Lebanon, ended up as an 18-year Israeli activity. They created a security zone in South Lebanon after 1982 and didn't withdraw from Lebanon until the year 2000. Will anybody participate in law and order and governance while Israeli forces are still in Gaza? Does anyone want to be seen as, quote unquote, complicit or working hand in hand with Israel at that point? So, the administration reached out to some of us right after October 7th and said, you got to help us think about this. Because we have a fairly good idea about, I'm going to call it Tier 1, and you'll see why in a minute. We have a fairly clear idea of what we need to do on Tier 1, which is how do you fix Gaza over a period of time? Who goes in immediately? Who governs? How do you get the PLO up to speed, reformed, rehabilitated, revitalized? How do you provide security and so forth? That part's easy. But are you going to get anybody to participate in that if all that they think will happen is Hamas 2.0 3 years from now? Another war that will destroy everything. So what we said to the administration, let's see if I can get there. There we go. This is what some of us gave to the administration. And you don't have to memorize it. I'll just tell you what it is. The top tier is what I said. The administration kind of knows what it has to do. So it has to, I can't read my screen, so I have to turn around here. So it has to end hostilities, it has to provide security, civil affairs. But it has to, at the same time, get to the underlying Israeli-Palestinian issue. That's the second tier. Now, if you look around in this region, you don't have leadership in Israel that wants to do that. Netanyahu, in fact, was quoted a few weeks ago as telling the Likud party faithful, he says, I'm the one that can stop a Palestinian state from coming into being, and I'm the one that knows how to handle the United States if they decide to put pressure on us. So you don't have leadership in Israel. You don't have leadership in Palestine. Certainly not on Hamas side of the ledger, and you don't even have it on the PLO side of the ledger. Professor Steinfeld mentioned a couple of the books that I co-authored. One of the discouraging parts of the peace process is that if you were thinking about 1967, in other words, that 78-22 split on territory, in 2008, if not before, we were extremely close to that. Ehud Olmert, in his book, it's not yet out in English, but he details how close they were to a solution. Palestinians didn't respond to Olmert's initiative, and they've never responded. In 2014, President Obama gave the Palestinians an ambitious formula for restarting negotiations that the Israelis didn't like. And Abbas took it home. He was in the Oval Office. It was read to him, and then we was given a piece of paper. Took it home, said, I'll be back to you in a few days. Haven't heard from him. That was in 2014, March of 2014, 10 years. So you don't have leaders on the Palestinian side. You look around, and nobody else has the standing to do anything except for us. Now the question then is, are we, the United States, is our president ready to do the extremely hard work, not just to articulate an idea, but to actually start to carry it out? And you run into an election year. Imagine if the president did what we're proposing. He gives a speech laying out U.S. policy and actions. He announces the establishment of our consulate general in Jerusalem, reopens the PLO office, demands the PA restructure, demands Israeli adherence to the status quo on the Holy Mountain, the Haram al-Sharif. Second stage, we tell them they have to stop settlements. They have to transfer some territory from Zone C to Zone B, B to A. Can you imagine if the president did that? I've told people that if there were ever a moment when I was in an elevator with the president, you know, I'm going up 45 floors, and this is my chance. I've got like 4.5 minutes. I would spend 4 minutes telling him to do that, and then I would spend the last 30 seconds saying, I understand why you can't. And if the president can't do it or won't do it, then this tier doesn't take place, and I'm not sure we get to that tier. So when you read about the day after, and it's the day after a package which is still not agreed gets negotiated, it's not an optimistic picture that gets painted. Now, I would love to leave you with a kind of happy anecdote at the end. By the way, ignore everything I said, it'll all turn out well. But I can't do that. Because right now, we're not only seeing an old Middle East generally, but we're seeing a particular protracted conflict within that old Middle East, which is only getting worse with time. And that's why, even if our president can't do it today, if we don't do it at some point, if you invite me back to Brown, I'll be even more pessimistic the next time. Thank you very much.
Should we take questions?
Sure.
Thank you very much, Dan. We have some time for questions, so if you raise your hands, and I just ask you to keep the questions brief so that we can get a lot in and allow responses. Questions? Question over here? Yes.
Hi, Miles McCasey. I was a friend of Bernie Tannenbaum's. I think we talked about that.
Thanks. If you could use the microphones, that'd be great.
This is a horrible question, and I acknowledge that. But what's your assessment of Netanyahu? Is he more of a grand strategic thinker? Or is he acting out of personal selfishness?
He fancies himself a grand strategic thinker, and in fact, in a couple of his books, he's articulated ideas about terrorism and so forth that are interesting. I mentioned Professor Steinfeld earlier. One of his problems until a year and 3 months ago is that he was much smarter in thinking about grand strategy than he was in implementation. In other words, he seemed to get lost between the idea and the execution. Now, up until 15 months ago, you could argue that, well, he really knew what he was doing because he didn't want to do the things that he didn't do, although I'm not sure. I'll give you one small example. In 1989, the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush administration, had asked the then Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, to come up with a peace plan. Bush said to Shamir when they met, I could come up with one, but it would be better if you came up with something, and I'll try to support it. And sure enough, on May 14, 1989, Israel developed a peace plan, put it forward. That day, some of us were in Israel, and Shamir invited us to lunch. We were the American delegation. And at a table like this, I'm sitting where Professor Steinfeld is, and Netanyahu is sitting at that end. He's the deputy foreign minister. So he was stuck with me because there was nobody sitting over there. And in the course of that lunch, it became clear that either he didn't understand what his government had just proposed, or he was seriously uninterested in implementing it. Now, it's one thing if we had proposed something and Netanyahu had said, I'm not going to do it. This was his government, his prime minister. And I'm not sure much has changed. Now, the reason I I set the cutoff date of 15 months ago is Netanyahu is now on trial in corruption charges. And he needed to fashion a extremely radical extremist coalition to remain in power and defer as long as possible the court cases from proceeding. And now he's stuck with these guys. It's quite an amazing bunch of extremists. Just today, I read a quote from Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is in charge of the police, of all things, saying Israel should stop negotiating for the hostage release because that hurts Israel's ability to pursue the war against Hamas. Not a smart political thing to say, but it tells you where these guys are coming from.
A hand back here.
Thanks. Thank you. Howard Schulman, Princeton, class of '86, by the way.
All right, we'll do the secret handshake later.
Okay, go Tigers. Two things. If Netanyahu wasn't in power, do you think Israel would have conducted the war any differently? And also, I was wondering, what's stopping the Palestinians from just like declaring a state, like Russia or the Bolsheviks or, in China, Mao just declared a state. So why can't they just declare a state? So it's like two questions.
Let me answer the second one first, then if I forget the first one, you remind me. But they have declared a state, and they have recognition from 120, 130 countries around the world. What they haven't gotten is acceptance as a state in the UN, because the United States has vetoed that in the Security Council, and they haven't gotten recognition by the United States of their statehood. But they consider themselves that their stationery says State of Palestine. So, they're trying to get that recognition, and it's not up anymore. But in the second stage of that bottom tier, we would offer recognition of the State of Palestine, because not only would it be important to give them something early on, but it also addresses some of at least one of the asymmetries in the negotiations. Because right now, let's say they started negotiating tomorrow. You have a state which is occupying a people and territory, asking those people to negotiate their way out of occupation into territory and into statehood. Never happened before. So in our design, at some point along the way, it could be the second phase, could be the third phase, whatever, the United States recognizes Palestinian statehood so as to somewhat equalize at least the nomenclature, if not the reality. Because even if we recognize statehood, they don't have an army, they don't have a government, and so forth. On the first question, who knows? The United States sent General Frank McKenzie to Israel right after October 7th to share lessons learned from Fallujah and other experiences in Iraq. You can watch CNN or Fox, and you'll see David Petraeus sharing those lessons every day, because we know what we did right, and we think we know what we did wrong. And the key that McKenzie tried to deliver, and Petraeus and others, is that Israel needed to define a strategy at the beginning of dividing Hamas from the people. Now, it's not hearts and minds. In Vietnam, we used to talk about, we have to win the hearts and minds of the people. Israel's never going to win the hearts and minds of Palestinians. They're on opposite sides of the divide. But the question is, can you develop a strategy to divide the people from Hamas? There have been a couple of demonstrations in Gaza against Hamas. Heroic, because those people may not be living anymore after Hamas takes care of them. But and I don't know what that strategy would be, but that's the strategy that needed to be implemented. By going in the way Israel did with such a heavy hand, it not only didn't divide Hamas and the people, but it threw the people in some ways into Hamas's hands with respect to when there's going to be a ceasefire and how this is going to end and who gets refuge where and who gets sanctuary in the tunnels and so forth. And you made the people, in a sense, much more dependent on Hamas than might have been had the alternative been pursued.
I know there was a question over here, and then we'll come back to the side. Yes, maybe just wait for the microphone, please. Thanks. Just over here.
Thank you, and welcome to Brown. Just last week, 100,000 voters in Michigan voted uncommitted in the primary, and so for President Biden, there's a very strong incentive to get this whole affair wrapped up. And then you contrast that with Netanyahu, who has a corruption trial, and the fact that no one likes him in Israel for the most part. And so he has an incentive to kind of just drag this out as long as possible. And so how do you kind of think those two factors play together, and how do you reconcile them?
Well, it's a political hand grenade for the president, because he has the 100,000 voters in Michigan who probably will not vote for Trump, but will not vote for him, and that could deny him the electoral votes in Michigan, which could be critical. He's got a increasingly vocal progressive wing within the Democratic Party that's asking for a change in policy. He has a Republican Party ready to pounce should he in fact start to distance himself from Israel. You have public opinion polls that show that Americans still support Israel more than they do the Palestinian side. And you have donors within the Democratic Party who probably are concerned that the president may come down too hard on Israel. Now, if you go back to October 7th, 8th, the strategy that it looked like the president was following was to support Israel to a point where it would create space to do tough things with Israel. Now, why would he do that? He was vice president under Obama, 8 years of constant tension with Netanyahu. And the language used by the two sides was terrible for 8 years. So Biden probably said to himself, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to support Israel, but that'll give me the opportunity, support Israel publicly, but that'll give me the opportunity to talk tougher and maybe get Israel to do different things. Problem is he hasn't gotten Israel to do different things. And that's where I think the frustration is growing. You saw Vice President Harris the other day either broke ranks or created new policy, or was the edge of the spear in saying we want at least a 6-week ceasefire. She first said just ceasefire, and then she clarified 6 weeks. That has not been the administration's policy up until that statement. But I think it tells you, my assessment is that she did not go rogue, that they're using various ways of sending a message to Israel that the time has come. The time should have come 2 months ago, but it certainly should come now.
And the second part with Netanyahu, like his incentive to keep the war going.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, keeping the war going puts the trial off, the corruption trials. And that's a pretty, what's the right word? It's not a nice way of looking at what a leader does, but I think it's pretty obvious that that's what he's doing, that he has put his own legal troubles ahead of what might be better for the country. And we're seeing it play out also in different ways. A member of the War Cabinet in the opposition, former General Gantz, has been in Washington, and Netanyahu has sought ways to undermine his visit. Now, the two of them are sitting in a war cabinet together. They're in this temporary coalition to pursue the war, and yet Gantz comes to Washington, and Netanyahu instructs the Israeli ambassador not to support the visit and not to attend meetings. So he's going out of his way to demonstrate that this is about him rather than about necessarily the good of the country.
Anya, thanks. Maybe just wait for a microphone. Thanks.
Getting good exercise.
Thanks, Ellen.
So I was going to ask you a question about that 30 seconds, where you're up in the elevator with Biden, and you answered part of it just now about what constraints. Why is it that you don't feel like you understand why he can't do that? So in 2 days, he's giving the State of the Union, and what would you have him say to address, you've got donors, you've got people on both sides, that might move us towards that template you developed. So what tools does he have, and what would you encourage him to say to everyone?
Look, the State of the Union is designed to look at us, at what we're doing, but I think I would recommend that he devote some paragraphs and talk to the people of Israel. And basically say to the people of Israel, you have a choice to make. I can't tell you what to do, and I don't elect your prime minister and your government. But on the one hand, your government is pursuing policies which are not healthy. You find the right words for that. And on the other hand, I will be with you if we try to do hard things to get to the bottom of this conflict. The way to get to the bottom of the conflict is going to be challenging. Israel's going to have to make concessions on territory and on other kinds of issues, on security. There'll be some question marks. But the president, I think, has the standing to say to the people of Israel, I've been with you since October 7th. I'm committed to remaining with you, but I can't remain with you if you keep going down this blind path. 3 minutes of a speech, 5 minutes of the speech. He's going to have families of hostages in the balcony, probably including the family of the 6 Americans who are being held hostage. So there's a reason to devote some of that speech not to our union and our future, but to the policies that guide us in that conflict. And I hope he does.
Just a quick follow-up to that, Dan. With the obvious situation of the American elections coming up, how does that fact and the timing of it influence how you think Israelis might respond to that kind of statement, and how Netanyahu would respond?
Well, Netanyahu will get all fiery, and he'll make speeches about how he will protect Israel from American pressure, and it'll be throwing a problem into the punch bowl, as they say. But there's a large part of the Israeli electorate that's waiting for it or looking forward to it. We saw that before October 7th with the weekly protests against the judicial overhaul proposal. Those protesters are now back on the streets, even during a war, saying Netanyahu must go and the policy must change. So, the president will be accused of interference in Israeli politics. We do that, and they do that here. It's a tried and true. When I got to Israel, Ariel Sharon was the prime minister, and I said to him in my first meeting, I promise you, Mr. Prime Minister, I won't interfere in your politics. And he said, look, don't promise something that you're not going to follow up on. I said, of course you're going to interfere in our politics. And I did. And that's because we do it to them and they do it to us. But I think the president has to put that choice, the very stark choice, before the Israeli people, because their own leadership is not putting that choice before them. And, they may choose to defy the president's wishes. And then they're a sovereign country, they can do that. But then we also can make some sovereign decisions about what we will support moving forward.
There's Ethan. Just away from Mike, please.
Hi, I'm Ethan. To what extent do you think the Biden administration's policies and approach towards Iran is governing or dictating how they approach Israel and the broader Middle East in the wake of the October 7th attacks?
I don't know if there's a huge carryover from one to the other. You remember Biden came into office wanting to get back into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action immediately. It didn't happen, not just because of our side, but the Iranians also were hesitant to get back in. And it's been very challenging to think about getting back in because the Iranians have asked one question to which the Biden administration does not have an answer. And that is, if we go back into the agreement and Trump comes back into office, he's going to pull you out again. What guarantee do we have that you will remain in, meaning that if you remain in, we have obligations on the Iranian side. And we don't have an answer to that because our system is such, you either have an agreement that doesn't have Senate approval, or you try to pass the agreement through the Senate as a treaty, and you won't get 67 votes in favor of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I was active in 2015 trying to help the administration get Democrat votes because the President Obama had committed to the Senate that he would not enter the agreement if 60 senators told him that they opposed it. And we had to work hard, and we ended up with 57 opposing it. In other words, we got through on the skin of our teeth. So we're not going to get back into the JCPOA, and that means that you have a long period of confrontation ahead of us in which Iran has been successful in using proxies before October 7th and certainly since. What I didn't talk about, and we can spend time on it, are the prospects for escalation of this war. Hezbollah, which so far has basically fought Israel every day since October 7th, but has kept it on a low burner. So there hasn't been an escalation. You've got West Bank, settlers out of control, could erupt in an intifada. Got the Houthis firing at maritime shipping. You have the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards in Syria. So there's a whole bunch of capabilities that Iran has that they're playing out. And on those issues, we support Israel, almost in a sense irrespective of what's happening in Gaza. What's the first thing we did, for example, after October 7th? We sent 2 aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean with a message to Hezbollah that if you start up, you're not only going to get it from Israel, but you're going to get it from us as well. We have a high-level envoy working assiduously to try to get Hezbollah to pull back a little bit from the border. The same envoy who arranged the Israel-Lebanon Maritime Agreement on gas exploration. So there's almost a schizophrenic attitude here where we have the differences of view emerging with Israel on Gaza, but we're of pretty much one mind on Iran, as long as the Israelis don't think about attacking Iran. That's where we've drawn our very bright red line.
Just go around. Yes, and then we'll come back here.
Thank you. I'm here with a group of high school Model UN students, and one of the things that we've talked about a little bit is how when diplomacy works really well, there's no front page story, and yet what we see every day on the news is often reflective of failures of diplomacy. And so a question I have for you is, what kept you in the game and what kept you from getting discouraged when, especially in the region where you were, it felt sometimes so intractable?
Yeah, I'm always optimistic in the morning, and I go to sleep pessimistic, and then I wake up again, and everything looks like it's possible. You're exactly right. The most successful diplomacy normally takes place behind closed doors. If it's really successful, you have to find a way to open those doors just enough for people-to-people activities to take place, because otherwise you have these 2 governments talking to each other, and it's divorced from the reality on the ground that people see. It's one of the reasons that Secretary of State Baker, in the period before the Madrid Peace Conference, conceived of the idea of the multilateral peace process. In other words, the object was you get Israel to negotiate with each of its neighbors, which it did, and you bring together as many parties in the region as you can to talk about issues that otherwise are not talked about because of the conflict. We had 5 working groups on water, environment, refugees, regional security, arms control, and economic development. And they worked pretty well for a couple of years. We also had a steering group, and I was the representative of the steering group, where the Saudis and Israelis were talking every day. Now, we're very happy that the Saudis want to normalize, but they were normalizing back in 1993, 94. They were in a steering group with 13 other players, and they were talking about these issues because we knew we had to take the peace process partly out of the negotiating room so that people could see what happened. In addition to the multilaterals, you remember there was what was called the Casablanca process. There were 4 economic summits that brought together a public-private partnership And they were very well attended in Casablanca, Abu Dhabi, Cairo, and one other place. But there were 4 of them. So, the reality is, when you're in it, the problem is not keeping going. It's avoiding negotiation fever, because you get so caught up in what you're doing that you lose sight of the politics outside and the societal stresses outside. So you need to have your eye on a lot of different balls up in the air at the same time.
Great. And one final question. Yes.
You're just stretching.
Mike is on the way.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Speakers always say that you should stop before the last question, so I'm waiting for the killer question.
All right, that's a lot of pressure. I don't know if it's that question. I was just gonna ask, do you think that after this war ends, do you think there will be a leftward shift in Israel because of Netanyahu's declining popularity, and like everyone has seen the consequences of his policies, or do you think it will be more of a rightward shift after October 7th? Because Israelis will think that will give them more security.
Well, short term, it's going to be an anti-Netanyahu shift. His poll numbers are almost below water, and it's very hard to see how he would win another election. You can't count him out, but there certainly will be an anti-Netanyahu shift. But I think in the short term, that'll also accompany a rightward shift. There's a lot of anger that October 7th unleashed, including among people who used to be counted among the supporters of a two-state solution, who are now saying, we can't trust them. And why should we get involved in a two-state solution? We'll just live with the occupation, and they'll have to live with the occupation, and tough luck. The question is whether over the longer term that can change. I don't know. I think we, the United States, have an outsized role to play in trying to effect that shift, but I don't want to get carried away and believe that we can do it alone. In other words, even if, let's say, Biden takes that piece of paper and he says, wow, this is exactly what I was looking for. I'm going to do everything under the line. It still may not work. And the Israeli people may say, thank you very much, but we'd rather stick with the army in the West Bank, and we'd rather not bother uprooting settlers and settlements. And we love you, Mr. President, but, thank you very much. It's quite possible. So short-term, anti-Netanyahu rightward shift. Long-term, I don't know.
Well, thank you for those great questions, but please join me especially in thanking Ambassador, Professor, former baseball commissioner, Dan Kurtzer.
Thank you.